Imagine growing up inside a family whose name would one day become synonymous with devastation, war, and the darkest chapter in modern history. Before Adolf Hitler became the architect of destruction, he was simply one child among several. A member of a troubled household marked by strict discipline, constant tension, and a pattern of loss that shadowed every sibling born into it. While the world remembers the dictator he became, far fewer know the lives of the 7 brothers and sisters who lived in that same house, shared that same father, and watched their family fracture long before Europe did. Their stories, marked by illness, poverty, resentment, silence, and survival, form a chilling prelude to the personality that would later shape global catastrophe. This is the forgotten and unsettling history of Adolf Hitler's siblings, whose lives reveal a family already spiraling toward tragedy long before the world ever knew his name. The Hitler family existed long before the rise of Nazism. Yet even in those early years, the household was marked by instability, grief, and emotional strain. Alois Hitler, the father, was a strict and often domineering man whose volatile temperament set the tone for a home defined by conflict and control. Klara Hitler, the mother, brought warmth and devotion. Yet she was overshadowed by constant loss as child after child succumbed to illness. Within this turbulent environment, Adolf Hitler and his siblings were shaped by forces far more personal than the political ideology for which his name would later become infamous. The 7 siblings represented a fractured family tree. Some born from Alois's earlier marriages, others sharing Adolf's mother, and many dying young. Their lives unfolded in the small towns of Austria, far from the global attention their youngest brother would eventually command. Some struggled with poverty. Others attempted to escape their family's rigid structure. A few faded into obscurity, their stories silenced by early death or lifelong anonymity. Together, their lives form a portrait of a household marked not by destiny, but by hardship. One that shaped Adolf Hitler long before he stepped onto the world stage. To understand the origins of one of history's most destructive figures, we must first understand the broken world he grew up in. A world built on the lives and losses of his 7 brothers and sisters. The family into which Adolf Hitler and his siblings were born was not one of prominence, influence, or stability. It was a household shaped by poverty, rigid discipline, and the emotional unpredictability of a father whose authority dominated every corner of domestic life. Alois Hitler, born out of wedlock and later legitimized, had constructed his identity through ambition and relentless self-assertion. As a customs official, he wielded strict control both at work and at home, demanding obedience, enforcing order, and often resorting to harshness that left a deep mark on every child in the house. His marriages, 3 in total, reflected the same turbulence. Children born from each union inherited not wealth or comfort, but an atmosphere overshadowed by his temper and the weight of his unmet ambitions. Klara Hitler, the 3rd wife, represented the opposite pole of the household. Gentle, devout, and maternal, she provided warmth and affection. Though her life was defined by tragedy, she endured repeated pregnancies and repeated losses, burying children before they reached school age and living under the constant fear that illness would strike again. This pattern of death carved itself into the family's emotional landscape, creating a home where hope was fragile and grief hovered silently in the background. The siblings of Adolf Hitler were scattered across these marriages, some half-siblings, some full siblings, each living through different phases of the family's instability. Some were born into Alois's early years of restless wandering, others into the later years of stricter domestication. A few died so young that their memory survived only in church records and whispered recollections. Others lived long enough to witness the earliest signs of Adolf's stubbornness, isolation, and growing resentment, though none could have imagined the scale of destruction he would one day unleash. What united the stories of these 7 siblings was not destiny or shared ambition, but the heavy weight of a troubled home. Each of them carried fragments of the same environment: loss, stern discipline, unstable relationships. yet their trajectories diverged dramatically. Some attempted to escape the family's shadow entirely. Others remained trapped within it. Their lives reveal a household quietly unraveling long before the world understood the magnitude of what it would later produce. From this fractured and emotionally charged foundation, we now turn to the individual siblings who shaped, suffered within, or slipped away from the early Hitler family narrative, beginning with the eldest survivor, Alois Hitler Jr. From this fragmented household emerged 7 siblings whose lives formed the hidden architecture of the Hitler family story. Some lived through only a handful of years, their short lives remembered primarily through records and grief. Others survived into adulthood, struggling against the emotional legacy of their father's temper and the quiet despair of their mother's repeated losses. A few attempted to reinvent themselves, distancing their identities from the family name long before the world would come to fear it. Together, these siblings reveal a side of the Hitler household seldom explored, a portrait of instability, abandonment, illness, and survival that shaped the environment in which Adolf Hitler was raised. To understand the origins of the man he would become, we must follow the uneasy paths of the brothers and sisters who lived before him, beside him, and, in rare cases, long after him. Their stories begin with the eldest surviving child, born from Alois Hitler's first marriage, Alois Hitler Jr. Number 7. Alois Hitler Jr. Alois Hitler Jr., born on June 13, 1882, was the eldest surviving half-brother of Adolf Hitler, the son of Alois Hitler Sr. and his second wife, Franziska Fanny Matzelsberger. His life unfolded long before Adolf's rise and exposed the early fractures within the Hitler family, fractures shaped by resentment, instability, and a turbulent father whose authoritarian presence loomed over every child in the house. Alois Jr.'s childhood began under the strict and often explosive rule of his father, a man whose temper could turn quickly from stern instruction to violent outburst. Unlike the later children of the household, Alois Jr. endured the final years of Alois Sr.'s second marriage, a period marked by illness and emotional strain. Franziska died when Alois Jr. was still a toddler, leaving him and his younger sister Angela in the care of a father who soon remarried. Klara Hitler's arrival brought stability, but it also marked a profound shift in attention, as Alois Sr. channeled his affection toward his new wife and the children she bore. For Alois Jr., this shift deepened an already strained relationship with his father and created a distance between him and the family that would define the rest of his life. As he entered adolescence, Alois Jr. developed a rebellious and defiant temperament, traits his father met with escalating conflict. He struggled in school, resisted authority, and eventually fled the household altogether. By his mid-teens, he had severed ties with his family, leaving Austria to work abroad, a desperate attempt to escape both discipline and obscurity. Yet, independence came at a cost. Alois drifted through a series of low-skill jobs across Europe, eventually landing in Ireland and later in London, where he became entangled in petty crime. His arrest for theft and fraud in England exposed a pattern of instability that mirrored the turbulent home he had tried to escape. Even after he returned to Austria, Alois Jr. struggled to establish stability. His personal life reflected the same turmoil. He married twice, fathered children he frequently abandoned, and left behind a trail of broken relationships. One of these children, William Patrick Hitler, would later attempt to exploit the notoriety of his uncle Adolf, a bitter irony rooted in Alois Jr.'s long-standing resentment and opportunism. During Adolf's rise to power, Alois Jr. attempted to reconnect with the family he had once rejected, hoping for advantage or reconciliation. Yet these efforts were largely rebuffed, and he lived out his later years in relative obscurity. Alois Hitler Jr.'s life provides a stark contrast to the mythic narrative Adolf Hitler would later craft about his family. Far from the disciplined, morally upright household Adolf sometimes described, Alois Jr.'s story reveals a home defined by conflict, abandonment, and emotional fracture. As the first surviving son of Alois Sr., he became both a witness to and a casualty of the family's internal turmoil, a man whose attempts to escape its shadow ended only in more instability. His life stands as the opening chapter in the story of a family already unraveling long before Adolf Hitler cast his shadow across the world. Number 6. Angela Hitler. Angela Hitler was born on July 28, 1883. The second child of Alois Hitler Sr. and Franziska Matzelsberger, and the half-sister who would eventually become one of the closest female figures in Adolf Hitler's adult life. Unlike her brother Alois Jr., whose defiance pushed him away from the family, Angela's early years unfolded under the dual weight of loss and adaptation. She was still an infant when her mother died, leaving her and her older brother suddenly motherless and emotionally untethered. Their father remarried quickly, bringing Klara Hitler into the household. A stepmother whose quiet patience and maternal gentleness created a stark contrast to Alois Sr.'s dominating presence. For Angela, this transition became the foundation of her emotional resilience, shaping her into a young woman who learned to navigate instability with quiet endurance. As a girl, Angela displayed a temperament marked by calm, composure, and an instinctive ability to assume responsibility. While her father's temper created tension and fear within the home, Angela gravitated toward the warmth and compassion of Klara, forming a bond that softened the harshness of her early childhood. She became deeply attached to her younger half-siblings, Gustav, Ida, Otto, and later Adolf and Paula, particularly during times of illness, when the household was darkened by repeated loss. The deaths of 3 of Klara's children in infancy left a lasting mark on Angela, who often stepped in to help with caretaking. These experiences forged a sense of obligation and loyalty that would later define her role within the fractured Hitler family. Angela's adult life began far from the turmoil that would eventually surround her youngest half-brother. She married Leo Raubal, a civil servant, and built a stable household in Linz. Her marriage produced 3 children, Leo, Angela Jr., and Gelly, and for a time, she lived a life largely detached from the family's ongoing disagreements. Yet the death of her husband, when she was only in her early 30s, forced Angela back into economic precarity, a shift that would ultimately pull her once again into the orbit of her half-brother, Adolf. When Adolf Hitler began rising to prominence in the 1920s, Angela accepted a position as the housekeeper and overseer of his estate in Berchtesgaden. This move brought her into direct proximity with her brother during the years in which he consolidated power. A strange and unsettling convergence of personal loyalty and political extremity. While she avoided the political spotlight, Angela became one of the few people Adolf trusted within his tightly controlled inner domestic circle. Their relationship, shaped by childhood familiarity rather than ideology, allowed Angela access to a part of Hitler's private world that very few ever saw. But this closeness carried its own shadows. Her daughter Gelly Raubal became infamously entangled in Adolf's private life, a relationship marked by obsession, control, and emotional turbulence. Gelly's mysterious death in 1931, widely believed to have been a suicide, fractured Angela's relationship with Adolf. Though she initially continued to work in his household, tensions grew, and she eventually distanced herself from him, leaving Berchtesgaden and withdrawing from the Nazi inner circle. In the years that followed, Angela lived quietly in Austria and later in Germany during the Second World War. She did not participate in Nazi activities and kept a low profile after Adolf's ascent. Her later life was marked by caution and silence, as her connection to one of history's most destructive figures overshadowed her personal identity. She died on October 30th, 1949, just 4 years after the collapse of the Third Reich. Angela Hitler's life reveals the complex, often painful intersections between family, loyalty, and the unimaginable trajectory of her half-brother's future. She was neither an architect of his ideology nor an active participant in his crimes, but she occupied a place within his private world that offers a rare window into the human relationships that coexisted with cruelty and catastrophe. Her story stands as one of the most intimate and troubling threads in the tangled tapestry of the Hitler family. Number 5. Gustav Hitler. Gustav Hitler was born on May 17, 1885, the first child of Alois Hitler Sr. and Klara Hitler, and the first of Adolf Hitler's full siblings. His short life unfolded entirely within the quiet domestic world of late 19th century rural Austria, decades before the shadow of his younger brother would darken the world. Yet even in this early period, the Hitler household already showed signs of the emotional strain and instability that would define its history. Gustav entered a family in transition. Alois Sr., already accustomed to authority and rigid discipline, approached fatherhood with the same harshness he applied to his work as a customs official. Klara, by contrast, poured tenderness into her children, attempting to soften the severity of her husband's temperament. The tension between these two forces, strict control and gentle devotion, formed the earliest environment Gustav knew. He became the first child to occupy the space between Alois's inflexible expectations and Klara's quiet warmth, a tension that would impact every child born after him. But Gustav's life was cut tragically short by illness, an all too common reality of the era. In the late 1880s, infectious diseases such as diphtheria and measles swept through rural communities with devastating consequences for children. Gustav fell ill while still very young, and despite Klara's desperate care, he died in infancy. His death created a deep wound in the family, one that Klara felt acutely and Alois, in his rigid way, struggled to process. The loss marked the beginning of a pattern that would haunt the family for years. Repeated pregnancies, followed by repeated heartbreak. Gustav's brief life remains largely silent in historical records, overshadowed by the events that would follow in the family and eventually the world. Yet his death profoundly shaped the emotional landscape of the Hitler home. Klara's grief deepened her protective attachment to her remaining and future children, including Adolf. For Alois, the loss contributed to an already strained domestic atmosphere, intensifying his frustration and detachment. In this fragile environment, the surviving children grew up surrounded by both love and sadness, carrying forward the emotional residue of Gustav's passing. Though Gustav Hitler did not live long enough to leave a mark on history, his story is essential to understanding the formative years of the Hitler household. His death contributed to the atmosphere of mourning, fear, and vulnerability that shaped Klara's later children, and it set the stage for the fragile emotional world into which Adolf Hitler was born, a world defined as much by loss as by discipline. Number 4. Ida Hitler. Ida Hitler was born on September 23, 1886, the second child of Alois and Klara Hitler. And like her older brother Gustav, she entered a household marked by contradiction. A father whose authority dominated every corner of domestic life, and a mother whose quiet devotion held the family together through constant uncertainty. Ida's arrival briefly renewed Klara's fragile hope for a healthy family after the devastating loss of Gustav. Yet the cycle of grief that hovered over the Hitler home had not ended. In a time when childhood illness was a relentless threat, Ida's life would become another chapter in a family history shaped by premature death and emotional scar tissue. From infancy, Ida grew up under Klara's devoted watch, receiving the tenderness and constant attention that were the hallmarks of her mother's nature. Klara, burdened by the memory of Gustav's death, poured every ounce of energy into protecting Ida, shielding her from the severity of Alois Sr.'s temper and the instability that often simmered beneath the household surface. For a brief period, Ida represented a moment of fragile promise, a daughter whose life might help ease the grief that had already marked Klara's motherhood. But tragedy struck again. In January 1888, Ida fell ill with diphtheria, the same deadly disease that had taken Gustav only years before. Despite Klara's desperate care and whatever medical assistance was available in the rural Austrian community of Ranshofen, Ida's condition worsened. She died at just 1.5 years old, adding another devastating loss to the long chain of heartbreaks that shaped the early life of the Hitler family. Ida's death, like Gustav's, had a profound emotional impact on the household, one that lingered long after the illness had passed. For Klara, it represented the second time she had carried and nurtured a child, only to lose them before they reached their second birthday. Such repeated grief carved deeply into the emotional atmosphere of the home, intensifying her attachment to the children who survived, and contributing to the near-obsessive protectiveness she later displayed toward Adolf and his sister Paula. For Alois Sr., Ida's death was another blow he processed through frustration rather than vulnerability, widening the emotional gulf between himself and his family. Though she lived only a short time, Ida's place in the narrative of Adolf Hitler's early world is significant. Her death reinforced the climate of mourning and fragility that shaped the Hitler household during the years leading up to Adolf's birth. She became part of a pattern of loss that would define Klara's maternal psyche, shaping the way she responded to her surviving children, especially Adolf, who arrived just a year and a half after Ida's passing. Ida Hitler's story is tragically brief, a life extinguished before it had the chance to unfold. Yet, her death contributed to the emotional foundation of a home already strained by discipline, grief, and instability. Understanding her story allows us to better understand the environment into which Adolf Hitler was born. An environment not of political ideology, but of sorrow, fragility, and the quiet despair of a mother who had lost too many of her children too soon. Number 3. Otto Hitler. Otto Hitler was born in 1887, the third child of Alois and Klara Hitler to enter a world already marked by sickness, instability, and profound maternal grief. His birth came at a moment when Klara was still mourning the loss of Ida, and barely had time to recover emotionally before she became responsible for another fragile infant. In a household overshadowed by the strict dominance of Alois Sr. and the quiet resilience of Klara, Otto's arrival briefly rekindled hope, a new chance for the family to break the tragic pattern that had claimed two of his siblings. But this hope would be short-lived. Otto's early days were defined by the same uncertainties that had surrounded Gustav and Ida. Medical care was limited, infectious diseases were rampant in rural Austrian villages, and Klara, though devoted, had no protection against the illnesses sweeping across families like hers. Otto grew weaker within months of his birth. His struggle was brief but painful, and doctors could offer little beyond observation and prayer. Klara devoted herself entirely to caring for him, refusing to leave his side, as if willing her presence alone to hold on to the life of yet another child slipping away from her. Despite her efforts, Otto died in infancy, likely within the first few months of his life. His death was yet another blow in a sequence of tragedies that carved deep emotional scars into the Hitler household. For Klara, it was the third child she had lost in rapid succession, a level of grief that would define her maternal identity for the rest of her life. She carried each loss with a quiet, crushing sorrow that filled the home with an atmosphere of fragility and fear. For Alois Sr., Otto's death was met with a mixture of frustration and resignation, widening the emotional divide between him and the family he struggled to control. Otto's brief life left almost no trace in the historical record. He is often little more than a footnote in the genealogy of a family that would later become infamous. But his death played a critical role in shaping the emotional terrain into which Adolf Hitler would be born 2 years later. Klara's pain and increasing desperation to protect her surviving children led to a deep, almost overwhelming attachment to Adolf, a bond intensified by the fear of losing yet another child. This attachment would profoundly influence his early development, shaping the dynamic between mother and son in ways that historians still examine today. Otto Hitler's story is not one of actions or influence, but of absence. A life ended too soon, leaving behind a silence that altered the emotional balance of an already troubled household. In the tragic pattern of early deaths that preceded Adolf's birth, Otto represents the third chapter in a series of losses that forged the atmosphere of sorrow, vulnerability, and maternal devotion within the Hitler home. To understand the psychological environment that shaped Adolf Hitler's earliest years, one must acknowledge these lost siblings and the impact their deaths had on the mother who bore them and the brother who survived them. Number 2. Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, into a household already marked by the weight of 3 consecutive childhood deaths, a father whose stern authority dominated every corner of family life, and a mother whose grief had carved a permanent shadow across the home. Unlike Gustav, Ida, and Otto, the siblings he never met, Adolf arrived as the fragile hope of a mother desperate to keep a child alive, and the unwanted responsibility of a father whose expectations would soon collide violently with his son's defiant temperament. His birth did not yet foreshadow the destruction he would unleash decades later. Instead, it unfolded within the ordinary struggles of a rural Austrian family, a world defined by poverty, disease, and emotional strain. From an early age, Adolf became the focus of Klara's deep maternal devotion. After losing 3 children in rapid succession, she clung to him with fierce tenderness, pouring her entire emotional world into his survival. This created a bond that shaped his earliest years. She was patient, comforting, and unwaveringly protective, while he responded with an affection that, according to childhood accounts, bordered on dependence. In stark contrast, his father, Alois Sr., viewed his son with a mixture of pride and irritation. He expected Adolf to follow a stable career path, ideally in the civil service, and responded with anger whenever the child resisted. Their relationship quickly deteriorated into a cycle of conflict, discipline, and escalating defiance. In school, Adolf showed early signs of intelligence, but refused to apply himself consistently. He clashed with teachers, resented authority, and retreated into daydreams of artistic success and heroic fantasy. He idolized German national myths, sketched obsessively, and nurtured ambitions that directly contradicted his father's demands. By adolescence, the divide between father and son had become a defining feature of the household. Alois insisting on conformity, Adolf rebelling with growing intensity. The tension ended only with Alois's sudden death in 1903, a moment that brought temporary relief but also fractured the fragile structure that had kept Adolf anchored to reality. Meanwhile, the emotional foundation of Adolf's life remained his mother. Klara shielded him from hardship whenever possible, encouraged his artistic aspirations, and offered the unconditional love that had become rare within the family's turbulent world. When she died in 1907 after a painful illness, Adolf, at just 18 years old, suffered a collapse of stability unlike anything he had previously experienced. Her death severed the one emotional connection that had grounded him, leaving him adrift, aimless, and increasingly isolated. It is within this context, loss, instability, conflict, and emotional dependence, that Adolf Hitler's early life unfolded. Long before he emerged as a political figure, he was a young man shaped by the same harsh domestic environment that had already claimed several of his siblings. His story, when examined alongside theirs, becomes part of a larger narrative, one that reveals a family defined not by destiny, but by hardship. The path he would later choose was not yet visible in these early years, but the emotional foundation of his adult identity. The resentment, the isolation, the volatility had already taken root in the home he shared with his surviving sister. To understand that final thread in the Hitler family, we must now turn to the youngest child, the only sibling who lived long enough to witness Adolf's transformation and endure its consequences. Paula Hitler. Number 1. Paula Hitler. Paula Hitler was born on January 20, 1896, the youngest child of Alois and Klara Hitler, and the only full sibling of Adolf Hitler, who lived long enough to witness his rise, fall, and the devastating aftermath that reshaped the world. Her life unfolded in the same turbulent household, marked by her father's stern discipline, her mother's quiet devotion, and the shadow of repeated childhood deaths. Yet Paula's story stands apart from the complex narrative of the Hitler family. Unlike Adolf, who would break violently from the confines of his upbringing, Paula retreated inward, cultivating a life defined by modesty, emotional reserve, and a deliberate attempt to avoid the public world her brother would later dominate. As a child, Paula was gentle, shy, and deeply attached to her mother. She grew up in the lingering grief that had shaped Klara's entire maternal identity. Yet, unlike Adolf, she responded to this environment with caution rather than rebellion. The two siblings shared moments of closeness, shaped by the tenderness of their mother, but their personalities diverged sharply as they matured. Paula avoided conflict, remained obedient in school, and displayed none of the explosive temperament that characterized Adolf's adolescence. Her father's harshness affected her, but she endured it quietly, developing an instinct for silence that would follow her throughout her life. The death of Klara Hitler in 1907 devastated Paula just as it had Adolf. But while Adolf drifted into instability and isolation, Paula sought structure. She completed her education and worked as a secretary, a practical and unremarkable path chosen by many young women of her time. She did not pursue attention, ambition, or ideological engagement. In fact, as Adolf drifted toward radicalization and political extremism, Paula grew increasingly distant from him, both emotionally and geographically. Their contact was sporadic, and while Adolf occasionally provided financial support, their relationship remained strained and overshadowed by his growing influence. During the years of Adolf's rise, Paula lived quietly under the alias Paula Wolf, distancing herself from the Hitler name even as her brother became one of the most feared figures in Europe. She avoided public appearances, rarely discussed politics, and kept herself uninvolved in Nazi affairs. Historical records show no evidence of her participation in or support for the atrocities committed under her brother's regime. Instead, she remained a marginal figure, living on the edges of events that would reshape the world. After the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, Paula was arrested and interrogated by Allied authorities. Her statements during questioning revealed a woman who claimed ignorance, insisting she knew little about her brother's crimes. Whether this was true or an act of emotional self-preservation remains unclear. But her life after the war reflected a profound desire to disappear from public memory. She returned to Vienna, lived in poverty for several years, and later moved to a small apartment in Berchtesgaden, ironically close to the place where Adolf once held court. She worked quietly as a housekeeper, maintaining a life of isolation, anonymity, and silence. Paula Hitler died on June 1960 at the age of 64. She left behind no memoirs, no political statements, no attempt to defend or condemn her brother. Only fragments of interviews and testimonies that reveal a woman trapped between familial loyalty and the horrors associated with her family name. In the end, Paula remained the most elusive and least understood member of the Hitler family. Her existence serves as a reminder that even within the household of one of history's most notorious figures, there were those who lived in the shadow rather than the spotlight. Individuals shaped by the same troubled environment, but driven toward very different fates. Paula Hitler's life does not explain the actions of her brother, nor does it absolve the family of the environment that shaped him. But her story completes the tragic portrait of a household marked by loss, instability, and emotional fracture. A family whose members carried burdens they neither chose nor fully understood. Among Adolf Hitler's 7 siblings, it is Angela Hitler whose story stands as the most consequential, not because she shaped political events, but because she occupied a uniquely intimate position within Adolf's adult life. A position that offers rare insight into the concealed world behind his public persona. While most of his siblings died in childhood or drifted into obscurity, Angela became the quiet observer inside the household of a man whose actions would devastate the world. Her proximity to Adolf did not grant her influence or power, but it placed her at the heart of a private environment that few ever witnessed. Angela's significance emerges from the intersection of 3 forces: her early suffering, her maternal temperament, and the strange domestic role she would later take on. As a young girl, she survived the deaths of her mother, her inheritance of Klara as a stepmother, and the constant instability of the household under Alois Sr.'s temper. This background forged in her a resilience and emotional strength that allowed her to navigate the family's fractured dynamics with grace. She became both caregiver and mediator, a stabilizing force in a home marked by conflict and grief, qualities that would later define her relationship with Adolf. Her role took a dramatic turn in the 1920s, when she joined Adolf at his retreat in Berchtesgaden as a housekeeper, overseer, and in many ways, the only maternal figure within his inner circle. In these years, Adolf was transforming from a fringe political agitator into a national figure, and Angela witnessed this shift from within the private spaces where he controlled his image and isolated himself from criticism. She managed the household, oversaw domestic routines, and provided a sense of order in an environment where Adolf's impulses were increasingly driven by ideology and ambition. Her presence was one of the few links between his public world of power and his private origins in a troubled, grieving family. The most significant and unsettling chapter of Angela's story unfolded through her daughter, Geli Raubal, whose close and controversial relationship with Adolf created tension, secrecy, and eventual tragedy. Angela's maternal protection collided painfully with Adolf's possessiveness over Geli, creating an atmosphere of emotional volatility inside the household. When Geli died under mysterious circumstances in 1931, the fracture between Adolf and Angela widened irreparably. Angela left his household shortly afterward, withdrawing from his inner life as he rose toward absolute power. Her departure created a void that Adolf filled with increasingly rigid isolation, demonstrating how deeply her stabilizing influence had penetrated the private sphere of his life. In the years that followed, Angela lived in quiet detachment, neither participating in Nazi politics nor publicly condemning her half-brother. Her later life was marked by caution and silence, a survival strategy in the shadow of a family name that had become synonymous with brutality. She died in 1949, 4 years after the collapse of the regime whose leader she had once served in a purely domestic role. Angela Hitler's story is the most significant, not because she shaped history, but because she stood at the edge of it, close enough to feel the tremors of Adolf's rise, yet powerless to alter its course. Through her life, we see the final thread connecting Adolf Hitler to the fractured, grief-stricken household that produced him. She became the living reminder that behind every public figure, even one as destructive as Hitler, lies a web of relationships marked by intimacy, vulnerability, and contradiction. In Angela, the Hitler family story reaches its most revealing point. A woman whose presence illuminates the emotional and domestic world that shaped Adolf long before ideology consumed him, and whose departure marked a moment when the last fragile connection to ordinary family life fell away. The story of Adolf Hitler's 7 siblings is not a tale of political power, ambition, or historical consequence. It is the story of a family fractured long before the world ever learned the name Hitler, a household marked by poverty, illness, authoritarian discipline, and repeated emotional devastation. Behind the terrifying legacy Adolf would later create lies a domestic world defined not by ideology, but by human fragility. The siblings who preceded and followed him did not shape history, but they shaped the environment that shaped him. Their lives, short and long, quiet and turbulent, reveal a family grappling with forces far more intimate than the global catastrophe that would one day unfold. Gustav, Ida, and Otto lived only briefly, yet their deaths created an atmosphere of grief that transformed Klara Hitler into a mother fiercely protective and emotionally vulnerable. Paula lived long enough to witness the unimaginable consequences of her brother's rise, spending her life in anonymity, silence, and guilt-tinged survival. Alois Jr. and Angela carried the scars of a father whose anger fractured the family long before ideology poisoned the world. Their stories show children reacting in different ways to the same environment: rebellion, endurance, escape, withdrawal. In each of them, we see reflections of a household struggling beneath the weight of loss and instability. Angela stands as the most revealing thread in this tapestry, a witness to Adolf's private world during the years he rose to power. Her presence underscores the unsettling truth that even the most monstrous figures emerge from ordinary homes, surrounded by siblings who had no control over the path one of them would ultimately choose. Her departure from his life marked the final unraveling of a fragile emotional connection that had survived since their earliest years. Together, the lives of these 7 siblings show a family in which sorrow accumulated long before war and fractures formed long before ideology. They remind us that history's most devastating figures do not emerge in a vacuum. They come from places marked by pain, loss, tension, and unresolved wounds. Yet the siblings themselves cannot be held responsible for the atrocities that Adolf Hitler would one day commit. They were bystanders, participants in their own quiet struggles, individuals caught in the orbit of a brother whose ambitions and hatred would reshape the world. In the end, their stories form the silent prelude to a catastrophe, an emotionally damaged household whose scars became part of the psychological foundation of a man who would devastate nations. And as their lives unfolded in obscurity or sorrow, they became the forgotten figures in a history dominated by the darkness of one name. Through them, we see that even the most infamous legacies are built on the fragile, human stories of families that break long before the world does.